Hello everyone, welcome back to Hollywood Cemetery here in Richmond, Virginia. In the past, I've visited a number of notable people in this historic cemetery, including Confederate Generals Jeb Stuart and George Pickett, along with Lewis Powell, who was an Associate Justice on the United States Supreme Court. In my last two videos, I visited the graves of the two United States Presidents that are resting here, James Monroe and John Tyler. This week, I've made my way to the west side of the cemetery, and I'm going to be visiting the grave of the only man who served as the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. Now, let me say this right up front. I know that in today's social climate, there are going to be some who are going to find a reason to be upset and even offended at this video. And they're going to find it necessary to make some rude and vulgar remarks in the comments. For those who feel the need to do so, let me tell you, those comments will be deleted and you will be blocked. If you find this subject matter offensive, I encourage you to simply move on and not watch the video. It's your choice. Now, with that being said, let's get to this week's video. Jefferson Davis was born on June 3, 1808, in Fairview, Kentucky. He was the youngest of Jane and Samuel Davis's 10 children. Samuel served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War and received a large land grant for his service, which allowed the family to move to Kentucky. However, Jefferson spent most of his childhood in Mississippi, where he received his early education. When he was about 8 years old, his father sent him to a school in Springfield, Kentucky, and he eventually enrolled in Transylvania College in 1823. After his father's death in 1824, his brother Joseph, who was 23 years older than Jefferson, became his surrogate father. Joseph was a large landowner in Mississippi and used his influence to secure Jefferson an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. While at West Point, Jefferson was a difficult student and often found himself in trouble. In his first year, he was court-martialed for drinking in a nearby tavern. But despite his troubles, he managed to graduate 23rd out of 33 cadets in the class of 1828. After graduating from West Point, he was stationed at Fort Crawford in Michigan under the command of future President Zachary Taylor. In 1832, he was stationed in Mississippi, where he participated in the Black Hawk War. When Black Hawk was captured, Jefferson escorted him to St. Louis, where he was held prisoner. Black Hawk later stated that Davis was a good man who treated him with great kindness. In 1833, Davis returned to Fort Crawford, where he became romantically involved with Zachary Taylor's daughter, Sarah. After a respectful courtship, Davis asked the future president for permission to marry his daughter. Taylor refused, but Davis was persistent. He continued to correspond with Sarah even after he was transferred to the Arkansas Territory. While in Arkansas, Davis was court-martialed for insubordination. He was acquitted but came to the conclusion that the military life was not for him. He resigned his commission and returned to Mississippi to become a cotton planter. He continued to correspond with Sarah Taylor and once again asked her father for her hand in marriage. This time, the future president reluctantly agreed, and the two were married on June 17, 1835. In August, he and Sarah traveled from Mississippi to his sister's home in Louisiana. Within days, Jefferson and Sarah became ill with malaria. Sarah died at the age of 21 on September 15, 1835. Jefferson would recover but found himself a widower after only 3 months of marriage. For the next several years, Jefferson spent his time developing his cotton plantation that he called Briarfield. In 1840, Jefferson Davis was a fairly wealthy man and turned his attention to politics. He served as a delegate to the Mississippi State Democratic Convention in 1840 1842, and 1844. At the beginning of the Mexican-American War, Jefferson volunteered for military service in the 1st Mississippi Regiment. In Mexico, Davis was assigned to the command of his former father-in-law, Zachary Taylor. He distinguished himself in the battles of Monterey and Buena Vista. As a result, President James K. Polk offered him a federal commission as brigadier general. Davis declined the appointment. Instead, he accepted an appointment by the Mississippi governor to fill a seat in the United States Senate that was vacant because the incumbent had died in office. He served in the Senate until 1851, when he resigned his seat to run for governor of Mississippi. He lost the election and turned down reappointment to his Senate seat. He remained active in politics, campaigning for Franklin Pierce during the 1852 presidential election. Pierce won the election and rewarded Davis by appointing him as Secretary of War, a position that he held until March of 1857. In March of 1857, Jefferson Davis returned to the Senate. During his second stint in the Senate, he was an outspoken advocate of slavery. He lobbied vigorously for Kansas to be admitted to the Union as a slave state. Davis and the other Southern senators were defeated largely because of opposition from the Northern Democrats led by Stephen Douglas. By 1860, the issue of slavery and states' rights had divided the nation. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Mississippi followed on January 9, 1861. 2 weeks later, Senator Jefferson Davis resigned from the United States Senate and returned to Mississippi. Upon returning to Mississippi, Davis found himself to be a very popular figure throughout the South. On February 9, 1861, the Confederate Constitutional Convention that was being held in Montgomery, Alabama, elected Jefferson Davis President of the Confederate States of America. On February 18, 1861, Jefferson Davis stood on this spot on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol and took the oath of office as President of the Confederacy. A few weeks later, in May of 1861, the Confederacy moved their capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. Throughout his term as the only Confederate president, Davis remained an advocate of states' rights to choose to be a slave state or not. At times, Davis found himself at odds with members of his own cabinet, and try as he might to hold the Confederacy together, the war was being fought on the battlefield, not by politicians and proclamations issued by President Davis. And the war on the battlefield was not going well for the South, and by early 1865, the Union Army was advancing south through Virginia toward Richmond. In March 1865, the Union Army broke through the Confederate lines, forcing General Lee to abandon Richmond and flee to the west. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet escaped Richmond and made their way by train to Danville, Virginia, where he met with his cabinet for the final time on April 4, 1865. 5 days later, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee's surrender at Appomattox and the surrender of Confederate forces under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston a few weeks later at Bennett's Place near Durham, North Carolina, effectively ended the Civil War. Davis and a few members of his cabinet left Danville and fled south through North and South Carolina into Georgia, where on May 9, 1865, Union troops captured the Confederate president near Irwinville, Georgia. With Jefferson Davis in custody, President Andrew Johnson was unsure what to do with the former Confederate president. He spent 2 years in prison waiting on a decision. Finally, on May 13, 1867, Jefferson Davis was released from prison after his friends, including Horace Greeley and Cornelius Vanderbilt, posted a $100,000 bond. Davis and his wife went to Montreal to join their children. He remained under indictment for treason until President Andrew Johnson's Christmas Proclamation of 1868, granting amnesty and pardon to all participants of the rebellion. Jefferson Davis never went to trial, as the federal government informed the courts that it was no longer interested in prosecuting him. Like many people after the war, Jefferson Davis found himself in financial difficulty. When he returned to the United States in 1869, he worked for an insurance company, and he wrote several books. In 1877, he moved into an estate near Biloxi, Mississippi, named Bovar. It was here that he would live for the next 12 years, writing books and traveling to events and Confederate reunions throughout the South. In November 1889, Jefferson Davis traveled by steamboat to New Orleans. During the trip, he fell ill and took refuge at the home of his friend Charles Fenner. It was determined that he was suffering from acute bronchitis and malaria. Over the course of the next several days, his health deteriorated rapidly. At 12:45 a.m. on December 6, 1889, Jefferson Davis passed away with his wife at his side. His body lay in state for several days at the New Orleans City Hall, and more than 200,000 people lined the funeral procession. He was originally buried in Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. He rested there until May of 1893, when his remains were moved by funeral train to Hollywood Cemetery here in Richmond, Virginia. Finally, let me say once again, I realize that in today's social climate that some people may not like the subject of this video. If you're one of those people, I encourage you to move on. You do not have to watch. Please don't. But if you do watch and choose to comment, please keep those comments respectful. Any comment that I deem to be out of line, rude, or disrespectful will be deleted and the commenter blocked. Now, with that being said, it's time for me to move on. So, until next time, please remember, life is a wonderful journey. Be sure to take time and enjoy it. And I'll see you down the road. So long, everybody.